most writers, I was going to write the world's great novel. And this was going to be the story of a my first physics, my first chemistry, a number of different subjects, scientific subjects, just in order to find out how the world affected people, how it changed the way they lived. And of course, why did I want to write the world's great novel? Well, everybody wants to write the world's great novel because they think that novels affect the way people act and live. They have an effect upon the world. And I wanted to have an effect on the world. I wanted to change the world. There were some very bad things in the world. I wanted to change it for the better. And so as I started reading these science books, I discovered that, gee, maybe there's better ways than writing to do that job. And I started getting interested in science for its own sake. And there was a well-known anthropologist who was writing he wrote many books around that time. His name was Houghton, Ernest Albert Houghton. He was at Harvard University. And in many ways he was a terrible man. He was interested in changing the world too, and his thesis was that you cannot change the world by changing the environment, by changing the institutions of man, because man made the institutions. You have to change man himself. And he was an anthropologist. And the only way he knew how to change man was to do things like take old and sick people and throw them off the cliff, get rid of them, euthanasia, try to do work through genetics, genetic engineering, and so on. He had a good idea, but very bad ways of going about it. And I was interested by the idea that in order to change the world, you have to change man, not his institutions. And when I came back to Columbia, I started taking science courses. I took nothing but, I had 1 year to finish, and I took biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, botany, geology, and everything. And then I took an extra year after I graduated and took some more science courses. And it was then that I ran into the Keller-Schoenfeld course in psychology that was just starting at Columbia. It was the first lab course in psychology for undergraduates. The first course that was given as a laboratory. And I was in the first group that took that course. And I had taken a laboratory in physics, chemistry, biology, zoology, geology, maybe a few others. And this course was the first one in which the experiments worked. These little animals did exactly what the book said they were going to do. And we shaped them, and we reinforced them, and we instituted schedules, discriminations. And some friends and I, who were all interested in changing the world, looked at each other and said, my God, this is it. This is how you change people. You don't do it through genetics. You do it through their behavior. And so I was caught. And I loved it. I just started taking courses with Keller and Schoenfeld and related people. And I was just doing what I wanted to do. Pretty soon I found myself going for a master's degree in psychology. A friend of mine, Donald Cook, and I did our master's thesis together. We came in early in the morning to use the undergraduate psychology laboratory. We did 4 experiments. When we were through each morning, we put the laboratory back together for the undergraduate students. And we did 4 experiments. 2 of them were good, and we tossed a coin, and each took one of them for his master's thesis. And apparently the master's theses were good because they accepted both of us for our PhD after that. And after 2 or 3 more years, I suddenly found myself with a degree. And I had never planned to be an experimental psychologist. I was just doing what I liked to do. I was doing experiments and learning about behavior. And all of a sudden, I found myself with a degree and a wife and a child. I had to earn a living. And so I got a job as an experimental psychologist at Walter Reed. It was a government job. It was a very poorly paid job. And everybody knew that government jobs were no good. And I said, well, I'll take that job for a year or so and then get a better one. And I stayed there for 9 years. And it was the best job I ever had. It was wonderful. It became a very well-known research group, interdisciplinary research group. Well, that was how I got into psychology. I haven't changed the world. How do I feel about experimental psychology? Well, maybe there's 2 parts to that question. How do I feel about my own life in experimental psychology? I feel fine about that. I feel that I've been very lucky. I have done what I wanted to do, and I've been fortunate enough to be paid for it. And, if I were ever going to have another chance, I'd be very pleased to do what I've done. I think there are maybe 2 things that I might prefer if I could have done them. One is to be a composer of music, and one is to be a pure mathematician. Those are the 2 things that I admire very, very much. So that if I could do that, maybe I would choose that. But otherwise, I'm pleased enough with my own, what I've been able to do. I've enjoyed it. As far as experimental psychology is concerned, I'm not very pleased with that. I don't think the science has gone very far. I think behavior analysis has. And I think behavior analysis is a new discipline which is separated intellectually from experimental psychology and has been for some time now. And at some point it will be separated administratively too, I'm sure. And then it will have its problems and somebody will separate from it. And organizations, I think, have a built-in self-destructive program, all organizations do, I think. Eventually, any organization, whether it be a hospital or a business or a scientific group, eventually their goals change. They become less interested in what they started to do and more interested just in preserving themselves as an organization, even if it means stopping doing what they were supposed to be doing. I think probably every organization ought to have a charter to exist, and the charter ought to have a built-in self-destruction clause. After so many years, it should go out of business automatically. And then, if it was worthwhile, it could start up again. But it would have to go through that. Businesses should maybe only last a few years. Hospitals could probably last a little longer. Universities could last a little longer. Governments maybe last a little longer. But they all should eventually self-destruct and start all over again, so that the original goals could be recaptured and they weren't just living to perpetuate themselves. Experimental analysis of behavior. Okay, I feel more at home in the analysis of behavior, experimental and applied. I've worked in both areas. I feel very strongly that any science ought to have applications. It cannot exist in limbo out there, unconnected with the rest of the world. And so I've done a lot of applied work as well as basic scientific work. It has grown very large now too, and it's having the problems of any large group. There are many behavior analysts who are not well trained, us who are called behavior analysts, call themselves behavior analysts. That's probably inevitable. I suppose in every science, progress is really only carried by a few people, no matter what the science is, physics, chemistry, or behavior analysis. So that's probably not a problem that's unique to behavior analysis. I think behavior analysis is beginning now to take a look at some problems that they haven't looked at before, that they've been severely criticized for not looking at, problems of human behavior, the development of knowledge, not just the relatively simple problems that arise from working with retarded children and so on. Very important problems, I think. But we've learned how to handle many of them. And it's time for us to move on. But I see signs that we are moving on. I think it's a very important science. I'm writing a book now, a book for general readers. It has the temporary title, at least, Coercion. I did a lot of work on coercion in the laboratory. We used to call aversive control behavior. And we learned a lot about why coercion is a very bad way to control behavior. But nonetheless, it's the most common way that people control each other, by punishing them and threatening to punish them. Rather than give them something good for doing what they want, they just threaten to take away something if they don't do it. And it's our most common technique in personal relations, international relations, business relations, family relations, universities, education, business, and it causes a lot of problems. Most of those problems, there were some prison projects which caused some very bad publicity, and justifiably, they were very bad projects, and they were done by people who called themselves behavior modifiers. So they were using behavior modification, which was the name that experimental analysis had at the time. A very bad name, because it's too general. Anything anybody does to influence another person is behavior modification. It doesn't matter what his techniques are. The techniques in these prison projects were very bad. They were aversive. They were aversive control. They said they were using positive reinforcement. But how were they using it? They were taking things away from the prisoners and then giving them back only if they behaved in a certain way. That is not positive reinforcement. That's negative reinforcement. And they were doing very cruel things. They were putting people in solitary confinement until they got to their knees and begged and promised that they'd obey everything and so on, and then they let them out and gave them a crust of bread. They were doing very bad things, and those were bad projects. They had nothing in common with the experimental analysis of behavior. That was a problem. When they called in experimental analysts to look at those, that was discovered. I know some of the people who were on the committees that examined those projects. They were horrified at what they found. It was not behavior analysis that was going on. But the newspapers, they grabbed the names, they published the criticisms, and the public impression is left. It's unfortunate that it was incorrect. Behavior analysis has never, except for a few. There are a few behavior analysts, of course, who do advocate aversive control. But as a science, it never has. Skinner never has. Skinner has always opposed aversive control. Even without data to support it, he opposed it, just as a human being. Now there are plenty of data that show us why aversive techniques cause more trouble than they solve, cause more crime. It's not that they're ineffective. They work. They do what you want them to do right away, but they cause many problems later. They create escape and avoidance behavior. When you shock people, you become a shock, and people escape and avoid and exert counter-control measures against you. And so you create all the problems that you were trying to get rid of with coercion. Coercion breeds coercion. What we know about positive reinforcement suggests that it's a much more effective kind of technique to use. More difficult, but more effective. Of course, I think a lot about the world as it is, and I feel the same way you do. It's some terrible things happening. But I think it's useful to think about those problems as a behavior analyst, because many of them are problems of behavior. They're problems of social interactions between and among people. And it may very well be possible to use behavioral techniques to change those interactions. That's why I'm interested in coercion, ways of getting rid of coercion, perhaps. What's our biggest problem? Our most dangerous problem right now is the possibility of nuclear destruction. Like we're just going to commit suicide. Somebody's going to have to do that. How can we avoid it? Well, asking the question in a way tells something about possible answers. It's avoidance behavior that we're concerned with. The big shock here is the nuclear explosion. So far, we've managed to avoid it, but we seem to be coming closer and closer to it all the time. Well, avoidance behavior has a problem. It's called the avoidance paradox. The more successful you are at avoiding something, the more likely that thing is to happen, the more likely you are eventually to let it happen. In order to keep on avoiding, you have to get a shock every now and then, sort of to remind you that you have to keep on avoiding. Otherwise, your avoidance behavior extinguishes, as we say. It disappears. The problem with avoiding nuclear destruction is if you let a shock, one of those shocks occur as a reminder, then you're not going to have any behavior left to avoid it. Everything's going to be gone. And it may be necessary to allow conventional wars to happen every now and then. Not desirable, but given the way human behavior is controlled, in order to keep the avoidance of nuclear warfare going, we may have to take some less intense shocks. Kind of a sobering thought, but it occurred to me when I was analyzing how coercion might be involved in all of this. That some shocks might be necessary. Some smaller shocks that'll keep us avoiding the big one. So that's something I've given a lot of thought to. We may have to shoot for nuclear disarmament, but not complete disarmament. Complete disarmament may in the long run be self-defeating. Many other problems that we have now are problems of behavior. One problem I see here in Brazil, the terrible lack of education for the young, and the terrible disinterest that the government seems to have in changing that situation. That was kind of a shock to me. I had thought that the new government coming out of the old repressive regimes would have as its first priority educating the public. Clearly, I've spoken to many people, clearly doesn't. Why is this? The only thing I can think of, I don't know whether this is correct, is that the people in power, the wealthy, the socially privileged, socially, politically powerful, have decided that it is in their best interest to keep most of the population poor and uneducated. That makes for a very difficult problem. I mean, their reinforcers now are of a sort that's bad for everybody else. For them to get positive reinforcement means other people have to do without. I don't know how you change that kind of a situation non-violently. That's what worries me. But somehow well, this is a behavioral problem now again. How can you somehow, how can an ordinary citizen influence his political representatives in such a way that they will support education, and if they do that, how do you make education more effective? How do you teach more effectively? And if you do that, you're going to get a larger and larger population wanting things that they don't want now, needing things that they don't need now. And that's going to bring conflicts. How do you solve those kinds of conflicts? These are questions I don't know the answer to, but I approach them from the behavioral point of view, and I say we have to find answers in our science to problems like this. That's where the answers have to be found, if there are any answers.